Bulfinch's Mythology is a 1867 popular work of mythology, written by Thomas Bulfinch. Uh, Thomas was the son of Charles Bulfinch, who was the first American-born architect, professional architect in the United States. He built at least part of the Massachusetts State House and the Capitol in Washington, D.C., like the Rotunda. But Thomas Bulfinch was a student of Latin and myth and history, and he wrote three books that were later collected into this large, basically 1,000-page volume. The three books being The Age of Fable in 1855, I think, then The Age of Chivalry in 1858, and then in 1863, The Legends of Charlemagne. So these three books were compiled in 1867 by somebody else into Bulfinch's Mythology. And for the next 80 or so years, I think, at least for the Greco-Roman myths, this was like a standard textbook of myth. It's Bulfinch is just writing the stories in an accessible way. And the reason I say 80 years or so is because in 1942, Edith Hamilton published Mythology, which is mostly Greek and Roman myth, but that kind of superseded Bulfinch in terms of modern accessibility and helpfulness to the reader, I think. But this is a really impressive and beautifully written work of myth. I will get into the details of it in a little bit, but first I wanted to read you a passage from the author's preface from Bulfinch himself with his mission statement, or his purpose, or his audience. It says, "Our work is not for the learned, nor for the theologian, nor for the philosopher, but for the reader of English literature of either sex who wishes to comprehend the allusions so frequently made by public speakers, lecturers, essayists, and poets, and those which occur in polite conversation." Which is, polite conversation, if you don't know, is, just kidding. But, yeah, this is meant to be mythology for the layman. A long time ago, 2 years ago, at least, I had this in my 10 hard books that I want to read video, which I might link below if I remember. But this was my big, hard book of myth I wanted to read. And after reading the first part of this, I really decided this isn't a hard read. This is pretty easy. You just have to read the sentences. Sure, there's a lot of mythological figures, people and gods, heroes, monsters that you got to keep track of. But nobody said you had to remember every single mythological character. This is just a work of reference, and you can always come back to it. There's a great dictionary and index in the back, where it's not just an index, but it has entries describing what each part of the what each entry of the index is. So, yeah, if you're reading a huge book of myth, do not worry about memorizing everything or knowing how each part connects. You will get there slowly, multiple reads, you'll see connections elsewhere, but it's important that you at least read it and sow the seeds, plant the seeds in your mind that you can, later it will be easier because you had that knowledge previously. But yeah, not that hard, but I will say, I thought that after reading the Greek and the Roman myths, which I'm already quite familiar with, of course growing up a Percy Jackson kid, Rick Riordan loaded us up with great info about myth. But then I've read a few books of myth otherwise, including Edith Hamilton, and I've read a lot of allusions to myth in other works that I've just looked things up. So for that reason, the Greek and Roman myths were easier. But once we got to the Age of Chivalry and the Legends of Charlemagne, it was a little more difficult of a read because one, you're dealing with great language here, I think, great prose from Bulfinch, but that weighs you down a little bit if you don't know anything about the topics that you're reading about. So you're trying to juggle all these new characters and appreciating the work on its own, just as literature. That was a little more difficult, so I won't say this is the easiest read, and nor does Bulfinch treat you in the easiest way. I know it's supposed to be for the layman, but I think the layman in the mid 1800s when he was writing perhaps knew more of illusion than we do now. Knew more about myth, perhaps. I might be speaking out of my butt here, but there was more of a common. I think there was more of a common history of the West that everybody learned at certain points, and that everybody referenced more. Now we've advanced 150 years. Things are more spread out. There's so much more that we can learn with the internet, that avenues of thought and what we should teach, when we should teach it to what students, it's all fractured, so there's less of a common canon, so we could say, which makes it more difficult for the average person to know illusions, because there's less of a canon per se, which the canon doesn't really exist, but you know what I mean. So yeah, a little more difficult than less difficult and a little more difficult, just depending on what I had come in knowing about this book. But overall, not a difficult work at all. The only thing is the length. This Avenel Press edition, it's illustrated. It comes in at 957 pages, but that doesn't, I checked, that doesn't include the 15, 20 pages of prefaces and front matter. And it also doesn't include the illustrations. There are opposite page facing illustrations, and each time one of those happens, it doesn't count as a page. And there's like 40 of them, 30 or 40. So like, I think we could call this 1,000 pages, even though it's 957. But yeah, what is in here? First, the Greco-Roman myths. This is definitely the strongest part. The book is called The Age of Fable. Also, it includes a tiny bit at the end of Norse myths and some Eastern mythology and a tiny bit of Hindu as well. Where did Hindu go? Whatever, there's somewhere. But the main 90% of it is Greco-Roman. And this part was the best, for sure. There's one, Bulfinch covers pretty much all of the important myths. I'm not a learned mythologist, so I can't say what did he not include. This is a pretty expansive book, so I think he included a lot. But almost every time there is a reference to one of these mythological stories in an older English poem or Shakespeare play, Bulfinch actually includes that allusion, or that passage at the end of his little story. So here, in the story of Medea and Jason, he references Macbeth by William Shakespeare, and there's a little inserted some lines where the witches are boiling a brew, and it's supposed to remind you of Medea. Or there's a lot of references to Milton, Paradise Lost, Comus, Lord Byron, Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, Shelley, Keats, Tennyson, a lot of the other great English poets. So that was really awesome to yeah, here's Tennyson and Shelley getting quoted, and then there's Pegasus, nice illustration. Daedalus and Icarus. Just a really cool book from Avenel. But after the Greco-Roman myths, the accoutrements of the references to poetry and the illustrations and the charts and the notes, there are a couple, but they really fall off in the next two books, which was, I thought it was kind of disappointing because I thought it was helpful to understand the stories more with all the extra bits. But yeah, before I actually go on, I wanted to say, comparing this to Edith Hamilton, Hamilton is much more helpful as an author. She talks a lot more about her sources for each story, where she got it, like what's the context about this. Bulfinch, well, I don't think this is a fault of his, but he's just mostly telling the stories. And that's it. So it's he's less of a guide than a relater of story. So you're not going to get much context. It's just going to go into it. Yeah. Next we have the Age of Chivalry, which is mostly the myths of King Arthur and the Round Table, as well as the Welsh Mabinogion, which includes King Arthur too, but English and Welsh Arthurian romance for the most part. There's no Irish mythology in here. But I was the most excited for the Arthurian myths. And I thought they were going to be awesome. And it was brutal to read. I mentioned in a prior weekly update how, probably last week, how I thought Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table felt like gangsters, like an organized crime group. They weren't actually they're supposed to be chivalrous Christian knights. They weren't actually doing anything good. They were just riding around in the forests, killing people and killing each other. And that was it. Like there weren't really any. I mean, if you have Merlin and Morgana Le Fay and the Lady of the Lake, like there's some magic moments, but most of the action was just between humans slaughtering each other, and like, oh, I'm the strongest warrior, and this is the most beautiful damsel in the world that I'm going to succor her aid and kill these other people, and we're gonna joust. And it was just that for 200 pages, 150 pages. And then the Mabinogion was the same. And I don't want to crap talk the Mabinogion because I wasn't familiar with it, but reading it right after all the other Arthurian romances was really brutal just to get through. I was dragging my eyeballs across the page. So maybe a more helpful guide to those myths could be of value to me, but I really didn't like them. It just gave me a sinister sense of like, these aren't actually heroes. This isn't actually chivalry. I don't know what this is, but it's not right to me. So that was that. That was book 2, The Age of Chivalry. Book 3, The Legends of Charlemagne. I actually got a nice primer a couple weeks ago for this with the medieval epic, French epic, The Song of Roland, which I made a video on that, but the Song of Roland details a battle that occurred between the forces of Charlemagne and, this is fictional, and an invading, or a Muslim army in 778 in the mountains of the Pyrenees at Roncesvalles in Spain. Based on a real event where Charlemagne's rear guard was attacked by Basques Basque Christians, but the crusading fervor created a new epic poem. Somebody created it. It's an anonymous author, but they were like, oh, the enemy should be the treacherous Muslims, not the Basque Christians. And it turned into this whole thing. But Roland and Olivier, they're two of the big characters in the Song of Roland. There's Charlemagne. Here in the Legends of Charlemagne, Bulfinch draws on the Italian romance epics of this same group of people, but he draws some like Pulci, Boiardo, and Ariosto, who did Orlando Furioso, and I had no idea. Orlando is the same person as Roland. Orlando's the Italian name. Roland was the French name for the same guy. But this is what I thought. The Legends of Charlemagne, vehemence against Islam notwithstanding, because that's what the time was in the Christian West. That's what I thought the Arthurian romances would be like. These are noble knights fighting against real enemies, formidable enemies, and monsters, and there's magic everywhere. There's a real wacky and I thought it was awesome chapter called Astolfo in Abyssinia, where there's a really out of pocket biblical appearance that most of the other stuff was like fantastical magic, and then we get this weird trip to the moon. I don't know what was going on, but that was a fascinating chapter. But yeah, the Legends of Charlemagne, even though they are repetitive and there's a lot of characters and the chronology was weird, it kept pausing after something happened and going, there's like 10 main characters. We kept pausing at one, going to the other, pausing at one, going to the other, and then like circling through. That wasn't helpful, not really knowing any of these myths. But it's a lot of noble acts and fighting for damsels and enchanters. Oh, I see where Don Quixote got the evil enchanter from. It seems like it's based on Atlantes, the guy who was trying to hide Rogero from entering the world. He kept kidnapping people. I assume that's where the Don Quixote enchanter is based on, but I'm sure there could be others too. But yeah, the Legends of Charlemagne kind of picked it back up for me in the end. So I would give the Greco-Roman myths, the Age of Fable, a 5. I would give the Age of Chivalry a 2 out of 5, if we're doing numbers. And the Legends of Charlemagne, I would give a 3. Like, it was solid. But because this is one book, I added them all up, and I was like, okay, this is basically a 3-star read for me, because the last 400 or 500 pages kind of dragged, which, if you're reading a book, it shouldn't drag if it's doing its job. But that's what I thought of it. Definitely an impressive work. I'm not going to get rid of it. Overall, I had a great time, and I'm very glad to have finished it. It's not as hard as one might think for being an 1850s, 1860s, 1,000-page work of myth. It's not that bad. Definitely, if you want something more helpful for Greece and Rome, Edith Hamilton's good. I haven't read Robert Graves yet. I haven't read many of the Greek and Roman primary sources like Apollodorus and Ovid and Virgil, some other people. I haven't read everybody yet, but yeah. So, dang, I talked for longer than I thought, but that's Bulfinch's Mythology. Big ol' Bulfinch. Yeah, that's it. Talk to you later.